December 2016 marked the 225th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Up next, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton re-enactors debate the need for a Bill of Rights. Their debate was at the museum in Washington, D.C. It's 30 minutes.
Well, good morning. I'm Anna Kassinger. I'm an educator here at the museum. We are a museum in Washington, D.C., and we're here to celebrate the 225th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. Behind me, you can see a printing press. Back in 1788, this was how everybody shared important news of the day, like whether to ratify a new constitution. And luckily with me today, I have Steve Edenbow of the American Historical Theater, and I have Bill Crystal, and we're going to go back in time to have Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton tell us about exactly why we should or should not have a Bill of Rights. So just to set a little bit of context, in 1788, we have successfully revolted from England. We are trying to form a new nation, and we have the Articles of Confederation, which unfortunately are not working very well. We have a government, but it's tenuous, and we think what we really need to do is create a new constitution that will bring us all together. But the question is, should this new constitution be ratified? Is it good enough? And Mr. Hamilton, I hear you have some very strong opinions about this. There's a rumor you might have been writing under the name Publius in some newspapers. Could you tell me about why we should or should not sign on to this new constitution?
Clearly, the new constitution was not the best constitution that could have been written. It was the best that could be achieved under the conditions under which we were operating. I had long known that the Articles of Confederation were not working. As early as 1780, I proposed that we have a constitutional convention, that we write a constitution that would actually do what people needed it to do. I think most of you realize we got through the American Revolution as if by a miracle. We shouldn't have won. But when it was over, we were absolutely devastated. Our credit was non-existent. We were unable to service loans. We'd issued bills to soldiers. They were not being honored. It was a terrible time. And the commerce between colonies was also very tenuous. We were calling ourselves states by then. So it became abundantly clear. I was serving in the Continental Congress with a Virginian named James Madison. It became abundantly clear to us we needed to do something different. So Mr. Madison and I proposed that there be a trade conversation between the states. It met in Annapolis. Only 5 states showed up. But it gave us the opportunity to say, we need to revisit the Articles of Confederation, and we agreed the following summer that we would meet in Philadelphia and do that. Now, Mr. Madison and I, from the very beginning, realized that we would try to revise the Articles of Confederation. Actually, we wanted to write a new constitution. I'm not sure most of the other delegates were as certain. We enlisted the help of those Americans who had the greatest prestige to participate in this process. I think it's safe to say some of the greatest minds in the country were there. Mr. Jefferson certainly would have attended had he not been serving as a minister to France. We knew that we needed a new form of government because without it, we were languishing. It was only a matter of time till we either collapsed or another foreign power came in and declared war on us and we would be defeated. So that's the backdrop to the Constitutional Convention. We work over the course of the summer. I'm not as active in it as I might have been. I actually spent more than a month away. By then, I already realized that the government that we were going to have, were this to be ratified, wasn't going to be perfect, but it would certainly be better than what we had. And I also had my own ideas about how we could knit ourselves together in a better federal union, which is, of course, another story. Yes, over the course of time, I was the author of more than half of what have come to be called the Federalist Papers. There were 85 of them. John Jay wrote 5 of them. Mr. Madison wrote somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 of them, and I wrote the remainder of them. They were a public relations blitz, answering the critics of those who did not want a new Constitution ratified, and at the same time trying to explain what the new government would do.
And Mr. Hamilton, so I understand one of the things you hoped it would do would bring everybody together so that we would have a federal government that could better protect and serve everybody. And it sounded like a really good idea. Your campaign was quite convincing. But there were some doubts, some holdouts. Mr. Jefferson, I think you had some grave concerns, even in Paris.
I received my first copy of the new Constitution in late 1787, and I wrote about it in December. I believed that it was an excellent start. It was a good canvas on which only a few spots needed retouching. I was entranced by some of the improvements, some of what they accomplished. For instance, the tripartite government, especially the bicameral legislature, balancing the larger states and the smaller states. I thought that the Electoral College was a good temporary expedient until Americans were educated enough to be able to handle the authority to elect their own senators and the president, which won't take but a few generations. But there were some things in it that staggered all of my dispositions to subscribe to it. For instance, there was no limitation on the number of terms that any of the elected officials could serve, especially in regard to the president. This concerned me. I thought, well, once someone was elected, and if they had done anything decent, any kind of a decent job where they would not be impeached, well, people become accustomed to that, and we're so used to aristocracy, inherited monarchy, that there's something in human nature that finds comfort in that familiarity. People would want to elect the same people, the same families over and over again, and we would create essentially what would, at least in practice, be a president who serves for life, and then perhaps his son would serve, and so on, and we would not improve on those who had come before. I also very much did not like the absence of a Bill of Rights. I was most concerned about the lack of a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights is something that every people deserve, to protect them from their governments, and they should, the rights that should be listed in the Bill of Rights, so freedom of speech and of the press, freedom of religion, freedom against monopolies, freedom from a permanent standing military, habeas corpus. These rights should not be left to inferences. They should be explicitly stated. I thought that was a terrible weakness in the document.
Yes, so I'm hearing from you that the Constitution, while it was a good start, was just too vague. And without specific limitations written in, we could be on a slippery slope back to a monarchy. Is that correct? Does that sum up your fears?
I think that is a good summary. All we'd known was monarchy. So fear of moving back toward it was imminent and constant, and certainly a rational fear to have.
Well, Mr. Hamilton, I can't imagine that you would agree with this.
Believe it or not, I actually realized that if the government didn't become something that was owned by all levels of society, we would fail. And not only did the ordinary people need to subscribe to what we were doing, but so did the rich and the well-born. Because if the people, the moneyed interests are not supporting you, you will get nowhere. But let me just back up a little while and say we didn't think that a Bill of Rights was necessary because we didn't, and I say we at this time, virtually all of those of us who were at the Constitutional Convention, who were present at the end, when suggested by George Mason that we needed to guarantee freedom of the press, we took a vote. Mason said, I won't propose it, but I'll second such a motion. It was proposed by Elbridge Gerry, and Mr. Mason seconded it, and it was defeated 10-0 because not just I, but many others felt that we had not taken any rights away from people, and therefore we didn't need to enumerate and guarantee any of them.
Oh, Mr. Jefferson, now I'm a little concerned. You're getting a little heated. I don't want a duel to break out, but
you have no worries about my entering into a duel. Mr. Hamilton's choices are completely his own.
Well, but you
fear
do
not,
have,
though, Madam, I will not challenge anybody in that way.
Explain your challenges.
I will, though, challenge ideas. One of the fears of having a Bill of Rights was that, and one of the rationalizations, as Mr. Hamilton has just partially articulated, was that, well, we weren't taking away the rights. We didn't put your right to freedom of religion, your right to freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom to petition the government. We did not put any of those in the Constitution as rights that you've given explicitly to your government, that you've given away. And so therefore, why have a Bill of Rights? You cannot list all of the rights after all. Well, I say it's better to have a half a loaf than no bread at all. I am afraid that a government so sparsely sketched out as ours is will follow the direction of every government that's ever existed, which is to take more and more power to itself, consolidating that power in a central, powerful government and taking those rights from the people. And if there are certain rights that are so essential to the existence of a free society, they must be drawn out explicitly, or they can be too easily challenged.
But Mr. Hamilton, isn't the government going to be run by people that the public have chosen to elect them? Shouldn't we just assume that they'll have the best interests of the public at heart?
One would hope, but I always realize that unless fit people are elected to public office, the system will not work as well as it ought to work. Let me just say this about the Bill of Rights, too, before I move on a little bit. And in the beginning, Mr. Madison and I agreed completely. We realized that a Bill of Rights, which Mr. Madison called a parchment partition, would not stop a government from doing whatever it wanted to or needed to, especially in time of war. And I think as one looks at the quasi-war with France in 1798 to 1800, you realize that the passing of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were laws that I certainly did not support or favor, violated entirely the Bill of Rights. The government took it upon itself to do it, and it did it. And governments will always do that when they feel threatened. They will remove these parchment walls.
But what has separated us from the peoples who have come before, from the constitutions that have come before? Though there may be in legends certain peoples who have written their constitutions, but we're not sure who wrote them, we know who wrote this Constitution, and the fact that we wrote the rules down, the rules by which the government must abide. We wrote that down at the very beginning. We did not create our government by warfare, by power, taking power, might equals right. Our wise men gathered together and discussed coolly their informed, educated, rational concerns and planned a government based upon their experience, their knowledge, and the knowledge of the ages. This set us apart from all history, all governments that have come before. We wrote down those rules. That is why we must also write down the specific limitations of the government as much as we feel as we are being threatened. If the government threatens more rights that were not stipulated, then we add those to it with amendments, and eventually, I think every generation, an entirely new constitutional convention.
But in that case, why freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion? Because I understand in the draft Constitution there are some specific limitations that have already been written in. So why these extra ones? Throw that to either of you.
I think it is habitual for people because generations have become accustomed to it. This is not something that I think will depart from human nature in just a few generations. For us to turn to our government as if to find what our rights are. That is dangerous when you have a government by the people. It is, though, a source of a threat and a source of my reasoning why I believe we have to write some of these rights down. People make the following error. They wonder, do I have such and such a right? Well, let me check my government. Let me check with my government. Let me check with my Constitution and find where in the writings of the government or the Constitution it says I have that right. That is the opposite of how rights work, and especially how our Constitution works. The way our Constitution works, as articulated in the 9th Amendment, is the following. If you're wondering whether or not you have a right, unless you look at that Constitution and you see that you gave in writing that you gave that right to your government, you have it. So then why do we have constitutions at all, at least in the tradition we've started? We don't have a constitution to limit the people. We have laws to limit the people, keep people from breaking each other's legs, picking each other's pockets. We have a constitution, Bill of Rights being an extension of that, to limit our government. If we fall back into that old habit of looking into the government, looking into the Constitution to discover our rights, then yes, Mr. Hamilton will be proved right. The lack of certain enumerated rights will be construed as the people not having them. But if we hold to that knowledge of that we've created something new where we have all the rights we haven't written down that we've given away, then yes, I think writing them down on paper in a Bill of Rights will give them an additional level of a barrier against being taken away.
Mr. Hamilton, what do you have to say to that?
I'm certainly not opposed to it. I think Mr. Jefferson is sounding remarkably enlightened. I once said the masses are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge right. And it's for that reason that we need good government to keep all of us operating out of what would clearly be the best interests of the American people. Alas, for me, it really, it was really clear that, as I said, this was not the best Constitution that could have been written. It was simply the best that we would be able to enact, given that opportunity. And as much as your idea of meeting every 19 years and
every generation
forming a new Constitution, yes, as wonderful as it was, I remember and think what a miracle it was that we were actually able to ratify the Constitution that we wrote over the summer of 1787. The American people would not have allowed another constitutional convention. Already we had moved on to other issues. Already there were grave difficulties. And I personally felt that the best way to knit us together in a federal union was to use the power that had been given to the federal government to tax. That would be the best way for us to become a single people. And when I say tax, in my time, taxing was not taxing individual citizens. It was taxing imported goods, and taxing luxury goods, not necessaries that people needed for their everyday lives.
One of the few things we agree on.
Well, since we have that, I would like to end on a note of agreement and hope, I think, for how we go. We have about 10 minutes left for question and answer. We have a wonderful audience here with us at the museum, and we have students online. So I'm going to open it up to the audience to ask questions. I'll repeat those questions so everybody online can hear. And then Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Hamilton will help us work through any questions. So, from the audience.
While they're waiting to percolate up, I would like to repeat what the great Dr. Franklin said shortly after the Constitution had been ratified. He said, "It is in place, it looks to be a sound document, but the only things in life that are certain are death and taxes."
Well then, who has the first question?
Can you tell us about your clothes?
So, a question from the students online. Could you please tell us about what you're wearing?
A sartorial query. Well, we are both in a similar fashion, at least of the era that our fashions come from. The clothing that I am wearing, it was, except for the buckles on my shoes, they were beginning to become a bit out of style, is of the era of the early 19th century. This would have been appropriate in 1804, toward the end of my first term as president.
I think probably for the sake of the audience of schoolers, if you could look down at my feet and Mr. Jefferson's feet, we do not have left shoes and right shoes. There was a single shoe that was made, and you had to wear them long enough so that they fit the one foot or the other foot. And frankly, when you got past that wear date, then you switched them and gained a great deal more wear that way.
I've walked more than a mile in these shoes at this point. 200 years.
It seems odd that we would be wearing the same shoe on both feet, but it was clearly a custom of our time. It certainly simplified manufacture, which of course for me was always a very important thing.
And we'd also like to know what happened after the Bill of Rights was ratified. What happened to your friendship, or not friendship?
Well, Mr. Hamilton and I never had what one could call a
cordial relationship.
We were cordial, and we, except in those what you would call cabinet meetings, where fortunately there was no amanuensis recording what was said. We remained cordial in public, though General Washington can attest to the momentary lapses in civility that occurred in those cabinet meetings. That being said, General Washington himself was well known And we both witnessed you on the battlefield as well, but also in the metaphorical battlefield of those meetings, his extremes of temper.
Although I think it might be nice for the audience to know that you had a number of busts in one of your chambers at Monticello, and among the busts that appear is one of me.
Yes, I had.
And
a
you were
statue
you
of
were
bust
you
of
were
Mr.
allegedly you were overheard to have told at least a few people that we were friends, and had I lived longer, our friendship would have been much deeper.
As time went on, and it's a shame that you weren't able to continue longer than you did. I know it's an awkward subject to speak about, but I did come to agree with more of your ideas.
I have a question.
Yes.
Ashley, she wants to know how long did it take to write the Bill of Rights?
Ashley would like to know how long it took to write the Bill of Rights.
It's actually a complicated question. Of course, I did not write the Bill of Rights. Mr. Hamilton did not write it. But those of you who are students who are watching, your teachers, I understand, give you assignments to write drafts of papers, and you roll your eyes and you think that they're doing that just to torture you, which of course they are. Builds character, but there are other reasons as well. And Mr. Madison's, or the overall process by which the Bill of Rights was composed exemplifies this. Amendments were proposed by each of the states. There were well over 100 amendments, without even counting in repeated suggested for amendments. Mr. Madison, being the one in Congress who was pressing most for the Bill of Rights, he was the one who brought them together, collated them, got rid of the repeats, and then narrowed it down to a list of about 17, I suppose, that was originally proposed to Congress. That was then narrowed down, sent out into a smaller list that went to all of the states. Individual states ratified. By the end, the only ones that were left of that list of over 100 were 10, starting with what was on original proposition the Third Amendment, which is now what you call your first.
I think there was something occurring at that time during the ratification process that I referred to as a rage for amendments. The people who were opposed to the Constitution were hoping to use the amendment process to derail it. It did not succeed in a number of cases, and Mr. Madison said if this document is to be adopted, it has to be adopted in toto and forever. But he did pledge to his own Virginia delegation that when he had the opportunity, he would see to it that a Bill of Rights was championed, and in fact he did. As a member of Congress, he was the one who took responsibility for it.
He made sure that he eliminated those amendments that would have weakened the government, and he kept only the amendments that had to do with personal rights. Clever of him.
Molly wants to know what would happen without a constitution.
Ooh, Molly has a great question. What would happen if we did not have a constitution?
Molly's question is a lot like things I've conversed with Thomas Paine about and read in his writings.
I believe Thomas Hobbes said it best, that we would be living in a state of nature, and in a state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short.
So, in other words, we would have no government, we would have an anarchy.
Or we would have the opposite extreme with our Constitution, I'll say it again, it bears repeating. Your Constitution is not meant to limit your rights. If you're wondering whether or not you're allowed to do something, do not look at the Constitution to find out if you have permission to do that. The government has to do that. If your government's wondering whether or not it has permission to do something, it has to look at the Constitution and show where it is written it's allowed to do that. So you look at laws that are passed to see what you're not allowed to do, what you're allowed to do. So if you don't have a constitution then, well, perhaps there'll be chaos. I think I'm more Lockean than Hobbesian in my philosophy. I think people would still gather together and work together in smaller societies. However, the bigger threat would be your government would see no limitations to its power and would become overpowerful, worse than a monarchy. You would have the old Roman dictators. You would have a tyrant. A tyrannical government that would have no limitations on its power.
They would like to know if Hamilton sings.
Student question. Hamilton, Mr. Hamilton, could you sing for us?
I know this reference is probably as a result of the hit play Hamilton, but believe it or not,
you're writing plays about it now.
I know, Mr. Jefferson.
When did they do that?
And you are not shown very positively in this play, I'm afraid. But I did sing, actually, to be honest with you. I was known for singing, and in fact, the week before I died in a duel, I was sitting at a meeting of the Society of Cincinnati, and next to me was Aaron Burr. I was asked to sing my favorite song, and I sang a story of campaigning called The Drum. I doubt that you knew it. You were not a soldier, sir.
Not a soldier, no. You're lucky that I wasn't. Another question that perhaps is related. Do you ever chant in rhythmic metered rhyme? No? I don't know why I had to ask that.
This is a wonderful question. We're getting close to the end, so any last questions from the audience?
So you're talking about how the government, we shouldn't look to them for rights, but how do you prevent people from being oppressed by other people who live in the country?
So,
as was already happening in your time, if you just let people do whatever, how do you ensure equality for us?
so let me just repeat it so it's heard, but we have a question from the audience, the last question, which is, should we worry about oppression not just from the government, but from the people themselves?
Hopefully the system of checks and balances, which was devised as a means to prevent that sort of thing, would hold. And when the many were oppressing the few, it could be addressed. And when the few are being oppressed by the many, it could be addressed. That was the system of having a House of Representatives and a Senate. That was the intent behind that. The executive branch was a check on the legislative branch, and of course the judicial branch, which is of course a particular chagrin, I think, to Mr. Jefferson, especially the Supreme Court. But it was intended also as a means of providing checks and balances. That was the way the system was intended, and that our system of laws would enable people to get redress when they deemed it necessary. Now, I know you didn't agree with that always, but
though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will, to be rightful, must be reasonable. The minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate which would be oppression. The government then, a government, any form of government, ought to, in its most essential form, be constructed and actuated for the primary purpose of protecting your rights. And your rights end where another person's right begins. So slander, libel, these ought to be prosecuted, though not by the federal government. If you use your freedom of speech intentionally to harm someone else, for instance, well, that is only using your right to infringe someone else's rights. This is perhaps definitive of the limitation of individual liberties. A government should be a tool used by the people to modulate that, to protect from oppression.
Well, that is just about all the time we have today. We'd like the audience to know if you would like to see more about the debate on the Bill of Rights. I encourage you to go to our free website, newsiemed.org. We have front pages from the time, including some tragic announcements of a certain duel and its outcome. We also have lots of free lesson plans and activities for teachers, as well as videos on the creation of a Bill of Rights. And so I would like to wrap up today by saying our sincerest thanks to Steve Edenbow and William Crystal for joining us, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
You're also quiet. Yes. Yes, sir, as always.